Greg Albo is going to wind up the beginning of this, but this really is a case where I think we want to leave some time for discussion amongst the panel, in addition to questions from the floor. I don't know whether Ian and Dennis want to reply, but I want to reply, John. You know, Greg, I'm sure will be more disciplined than I was.
Yes.
And assuming he is, we'll have time for about 15 minutes of questions from the floor and then responses from the panel.
So I'm not going to make a direct response or defense of our title, but I want to place what we attempted to do in this book, in this volume, in relationship to a longer-term publishing perspective we've had since the 2008-2010 crisis, the financial crisis that still kind of frames our politics and our strategic choices. The first 5-year chunk of volumes we did, particularly laying out the crisis and the changes in class formation. The second chunk has been about the beginning with the current political setting and the politics of the right, and a long-term perspective on thinking about revolution, socialist forces today, and the various possibilities where we can ground those socialist forces is what we have on the agenda. This began with the volume on the politics of the right as a reading of the current conjuncture and the danger of the right for socialist forces, for political forces, for further divisions in the working class. And the volume from last year, which is a companion volume to this year on Rethinking Revolution, was about putting this also in longer-term perspective, the impact and meaning of revolution, and how we can break out of defining our politics in terms of the Bolshevik revolution. And I think that volume brought together an incredible set of essays. I still think it hangs together as one of the best of the reflections on the meaning of 1917 with Jodi, with her perspective, Zizek, Baudu, Brian Palmer, and Joan Sangster, Coveras, Wainwright, Andreas Baum, Adolf Reed, Wang Wei. So a remarkable set of different views of how to rethink the politics of revolution. That, of course, involves not only rethinking the legacy and reinterpretation of 1917, but also what it meant for democracy and democratic practices and some of the problems that occurred in the post-revolutionary period. And of course it connects to Marx and Engels directly through the politics of the class of 1848, the politics of the First International, and of course the institutional or the initial challenge to liberal democracy that came from working class politics, which Dennis was speaking towards. It also, of course, was integral to what we began the new millennium as raising in terms of the 21st century socialism. But it is also a challenge in a sense to rethink all those other terms that we often use to describe our actually existing democracy. False democracy, post-democracy, non-democracy, democracy without alternatives, and so on. What we attempted to do in this volume on Rethinking Democracy is precisely to speak to the limits of liberal democracy and the difficulty and challenges and practices we have to do to make socialist democracy. Socialist democracy in reflecting on the limits and legacies of liberal democracy, on confronting the administrative modes, the practices, the kinds of political parties, what those strategies of those political parties will need to establish a revolutionary socialist democracy, but also the coupled condition that has also been part of the left in its thinking of democracy, and that is how do we build the conditions and capacities for the working class movement to strengthen their position in society today and build a longer-term capacity to overthrow capitalism. In the preface, we put it this way, very briefly in thinking of this period, if I can quote, the volume, The Politics of the Right, examined in close detail across a broad range of states the antagonism between capitalism and democracy, which partly, I guess, gets a certain difference with Jodi's interpretation, that is increasingly visible. And here's more of a commonality. It becomes, in this context, all the more important to lay some foundations for the new visions, organizations, practices, and institutions that will be required for the development of socialist democracy in the 21st century. And quite clearly, we put the question of a political party that's building the political capacities, the capacities for class struggle at the center of that. In fact, in a remarkable essay, I think one of the best critiques of radical democracy, alongside some of Jodi's work by Alex Demirovich on radical democracy, we conclude the volume exactly with a theme along this line. Politics is a sphere in which particularistic groups argue to create a universality that will remain particularistic, our particular dilemma in North America today. After all, they are forced to assert themselves by means of special identities in order to preempt potential exclusion, which they simultaneously practice themselves. In contrast to this, the socialist perspective lays claim to a self-determined cooperation in the course of which supposedly constitutive disputes will be replaced by reconciled forms of coordination. When people leave prehistory behind and begin to shape their own living conditions, which of course can only be done through revolutionary ruptures, the task of coordination will be greater than is the case now. The task of coordination, of course, being questions of democratic self-governance. However, such tasks will be distributed widely so as to involve many people, and these tasks will be conceived as part of social labor. In other words, a socialist democracy is what this volume stands for, and what we stand for, and what the title, Rethinking Actually Existing Liberal Democracy, if we went for the long form, what we meant by that. Thank you.
That does give us 15 minutes for posing questions. We'll take a series of them, I think would be best, and then we'll go back to Dennis and Ian and Jodi.
All right, well, thank you, and thanks for the questions. Let me try to dispatch the working class identity one by not actually answering it. That's a huge, huge question, and suffice to say, I end my piece by noting that the unmaking of the working class is one of the most serious challenges that we face. Not because there isn't a working class, there's a huge working class, probably as big or bigger than it's ever been, but it of course has changed. It's always changing. The myth of a unified, one-dimensional working class was always a myth. It's always been an aggregate mix of all kinds of differences split along ethnic and gender and religious and sexual lines. And so it's always been a challenge to bring that group together. That is the work of the left to do that, and usually, of course, traditionally through a political party. So yeah, we've definitely got our work cut out for us, not because there aren't workers who don't need the kinds of politics that we're talking about, but because we need, as Jeff Ely once said, to constantly innovate on the left, constantly come up with new ways of engaging and organizing precisely to bring that experience to the fore. Part of what allows a revolution to occur is that people's experience is multiple. It's all over the map. And then different conditions can spark or mobilize aspects of that multifaceted experience. If people were just one-dimensional, if they just had one way of understanding the world, our work would be hopeless. But it isn't, and that's why sometimes things can change so quickly, so dramatically, so surprisingly, precisely because people are mad as hell, and they don't want to take it anymore. But without any sense of leadership, without a sense of possibility, it's very hard to choose anything different. I want to thank Jodi for her comments. Biting, incisive, to the point. I found myself agreeing with most of them, and surprised to be accused of taking the working class struggle out of the story, because I thought that's exactly what I was trying to do, was to put it in. In fact, the characterization of the piece is very much about moving away from these neutral characterizations of inclusion, but rather to name names. Who's for it? Who's against it? And in calling out the right as being fundamentally opposed to democracy, it's precisely to try to put those conflicting interests at the forefront of our discussions of democracy. The difficulty, of course, in responding to Jodi is that I think that I would need to read her comments and be able to respond, because there's an awful lot there. I did feel that at times Jodi was importing back into the discussion the very terms that I was contesting. And so in that sense, I'm sort of being accused of being guilty of the thing that I'm trying to actually put on trial with my piece. So I think an engagement in print would allow us to suss through these really, really important issues, because Jodi is putting at the forefront the classic Leninist insight. Will they let us? Right? That was Lenin's, one of many of Lenin's insights, is that, democracy is a lovely idea, but the ruling class are never going to let us do it. And that's what, of course, sparked the communist movement. And then, of course, the communist movement sparked this actually existing democracy, because one of the key influences on the shift during and after World War I was the Russian Revolution, which scared the shit out of elites across Europe, who thought, the day has come, it's nigh. And suddenly, faced with this idea of revolution, we're prepared to deal. We're prepared to offer up some concessions, but of course, by trying to take the sting out of democracy. And I would disagree with Jodi on just how much everything is in the control of the powerful. I mean, she's absolutely right to suggest they're not going to sit idly by while we say, great, we've got our democracy, and we're going to take away what you have. That's pretty obvious that's not going to happen. But at the same time, billions of dollars are spent on these rituals, these spectacles of democracy. And if it was all done, if the deal was cooked, they wouldn't need to spend anything. So the fact that they struggle so hard to maintain control over what's going on suggests that there are more openings. As someone mentioned, democracy, no matter how you define it, has embedded within it a radical kernel of equality. And it's dangerous. Every election, no matter how fixed it looks, is dangerous for the ruling groups, because it could always get out of their control. So again, in trying to understand, the point of my piece was not to suggest that democracy replaced class struggle as the central motif of left organizing. If anything, it was an attempt to resurrect that. But it was to try to clarify our thinking about what it is we're talking about when we talk about democracy, precisely so that we can separate out the real gains of working people. If we've got anything, if there's any opening, if there's anything in our contemporary democracy, we owe it to the struggles of working people who took advantage of the opportunities, the unpredictable historical events, the divisions amongst the ruling class, to open up a space to do some stuff. And as flawed as our democracy is, it has led to some gains for working people. Should we be satisfied or happy with that? Of course not. But it does inform how we might move forward. And I don't disagree with Jodi's objective, which of course is overthrowing capitalism. The challenge is to figure out how. Revolutionary Party? Absolutely, sign me up. But our work isn't done by just establishing that. We've still got to figure out how to organize all the people and overthrow the system. And in that, democracy could be part of the process.
Great questions. I think the McPherson-Gramsci challenge to you and to Jodi and to those who continue to advocate a kind of communist vision. The McPherson-Gramsci challenge is to say, get real. Get real about where you are in this extremely bourgeois city. Get real with your fellow citizens who may consider themselves middle class mistakenly. And one classic Leninist approach would be to say, you dumbcuffs, you should realize that your minds are full of garbage. And I think the left has certainly tried that approach in Toronto. We're doing a new book on the Toronto New Left from the 50s to the 80s, and we've counted up, I think it's 18 vanguard Leninist parties. Many of them made interesting points. But I think a mature, realistic, new politics requires you soberly reflect upon that legacy. You soberly work through the Comintern papers. You soberly work through the communist tradition. And it cannot simply be a word that is thrown around and used to electrify an audience, it has to be a sober, serious word. Gramsci would counsel against a war of maneuver, and I think it's all more pertinent in a thermonuclear age. A war of maneuver in which you simply declare your absolute, we're going to overthrow the state tomorrow. March down the street with our red flags, maybe break a few windows at McDonald's or the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, and we will feel like we have done something. The real challenge is to say, who have you actually brought into your way of looking at the new world? And that's where I find liminal figures, people who are not easily typecast, especially in a very strict reading of the Leninist versus non-Leninist traditions, like Gramsci and like McPherson. I find them immensely suggestive in our own period because they are saying to you, get real. It's not a slogan. It's an actual life or death politics for the human species. So that's where I would basically take this, and I think you would be misreading me and misreading McPherson if you said, hey, that's it's like a Blairite formula for cozying up to the middle class and everybody should love property rights. That's such a radical misreading because the property that McPherson's basically trying to take that word property and beat the hell out of it and take it in all sorts of directions that it's not really intended to go. And he's trying to say, look at your accessing clean water and your housing and you have a right to employment. These are all property rights. He thinks calling them property rights gives them a prestige in the system that they wouldn't normally have. And as for cozying up to the middle class, he's basically saying to the middle class, yes, I respect your love of freedom, and I respect the liberal tradition defined as, especially in McPherson's eye, liberty and equality, a continuing long-term discourse around liberty and equality that cannot be easily thrown away, especially if you want to talk to people outside this room. But he's saying to the middle class, what you haven't realized is that the system of property under which you have flourished is a death trap, and it has to be changed fundamentally. I think in many ways McPherson was getting to a far more radical place than any left of the NDP I have ever known. He was really getting further left than many communists, certainly the communists in the Canadian tradition. So there's this paradox of McPherson you have to wrestle with, and I think that the overall burden of a kind of push back would be to say, I'm willing to march down the street with a red flag and say down with capitalism and sing the Internationale. It would make me feel very sentimental. I love the song. The real part of it is who is being changed by that experience. Smash up the windows of the bank or the McDonald's. Who have you lastingly transformed by that? You maybe provided bonanza for the insurers of those establishments and the people who put in plate glass windows. But the whole thrust of the Gramscian revolution, which Leninists have had such a difficult time understanding or responding to meaningfully, is take a sober look at this history and see where you are. Start where you are, not with this kind of highly hypothesized vision of capital or revolution. Over and over again, especially in a bourgeois city like this, that will simply lead you to the status of isolation and sectarianism.
Now, this is really unfair because she not only gets the last word tonight, she gets the chance to lay out her theses on the Comrade tomorrow night. But we'll give her a few minutes tonight.
First, I'm going to try to take on some of the specific questions and then say something more general at the end. Is that too better? Like there? Okay. On the question about, wait a minute, there's attacks going on things like voting rights, shouldn't we defend those? Sure. But the thing is that regular old Democrats defend those. So there's nothing specifically socialist or communist about defending those things. So it doesn't mean that one should be against them. But it's like, if what we're talking about is what is a vision for socialism or communism, we shouldn't just say that it's the exact same as the middle of the Democratic Party. So that's what, that to me is a real concern. And it's not good for the left to be unable to distinguish its view from liberal view, right? We need to be able to draw, to be able to tell the difference. So that's what I'd say on that one. So it's not like I'm arguing against democracy here. I'm not saying that democracy is bad. I'm saying democracy is inadequate as the name for a socialist vision. We have to have more, right? When we talk about strictly in terms of democracy, we lose the role of the economy. Right? A socialist and a communist vision is supposed to also be about the administration of production, having production based on need, and not production based for the private benefit of the few. That gets lost when everything goes to this political level of just talking about democracy or democratic institutions. So I don't think that the primary contradiction is between democratic and anti-democratic forces today. I think the primary contribution remains the division between capital and labor. We haven't overcome that. So I think socialists should need to remember this very basic thing. Let's see, on the democracy and health. Basically, when I deal with students, I try to bring out all the time the configuring role of the capitalist economy on the options that we have. In the US, this is a much worse situation, considering we don't have health, national health care. We don't even have, the government doesn't regulate pharmaceutical prices. It's really quite abysmal. So it's a little bit easier. So the capitalist system argument as an influence on health makes a lot of sense in a way that might make it a little bit more challenging in the in the Canadian context to make that argument. Let me see what other last thing I want to say. It actually says to me the continued strength that communism has, that Ian would have to parody a defense of communism as smashing windows and marching around with red flags, as if communist parties didn't do a lot of everyday organizing, tenant organizing, working with labor unions, building skills and capacities of the people who are members, trying to expand, engaging in lots of debate and discussion. So I think that it's important that as we think about what an actual socialist or communist future can be, that we don't rely on those kinds of sort of super dismissive stereotypes.
Why don't you take the last word, Julie? You wanted something to say?
No, I think I'll just thank you all for coming. Thank Jodi, Ian, and Dennis for their contributions to the Register. To remind you that tomorrow night at 6 p.m. at Ryerson University, Jodi is going to be speaking to the concept of the comrade, 4 theses on the comrade. And we can continue this discussion and maybe challenge Jodi.
Be challenged
in terms of what happens to democratic practices inside the party. What is the meaning of democratic centralism to the comrade? And how are we going to make that meaning a different than what it turned out to be for much of the 20th century? Okay, thank you very much.